So our final segment is continuing with the theme of children, childhood and vulnerability. And we will begin with the idea of not children in the family, which we were dealing with in the previous segment, but children in and society. First of all, we'll begin with the idea of the child worker. Now, children work. Right? In our homes also, we ask children to do small jobs, pick things up, put them away, clear up their toys. We ask them to do some small work or the other. Right? That's how you also bring them up within the family. But when you think about children as working children, then it is a question of labor rights, but also exploitation. One of the Now, in the late 18th and early 20th centuries, early 19th centuries and through the 19th centuries, child labor was seen as par for the course. And one of the early works on child labor was Henry Mayhew's London Labour and London Poor, which dealt with and interviewed children from the laboring classes. Now, why is it that we think of the child as somebody who should be exempt from working for a living? It's also because we think of the child as a privileged category, that they should be educated, that they should have a life which is not spent in various forms of hard labor, which then destroy them physically as well as mentally. So we have an excerpt from there, and this is one of the most famous excerpts from Mayhew's London Labour and London Poor. It is to do with somebody called the watercress girl. The watercress girl who speaks about herself, and she says, as she goes about the streets with watercresses crying, 4 bunches a penny, watercresses. And she says, I'm just 8 years old. That's all. Now, when we think of an 8-year-old in our contemporary society, we are thinking in terms of a child who is in, say, class 4, maybe not even class 4, maybe class 3, class 4, right? And yet here is a child who says, I've been very near a 12-month in the streets. That means she's been working and selling watercresses for over a year or nearly a year. And then she goes on to say that before that, I had to take care of a baby for my aunt. It wasn't heavy. It was only 2 months old. But I minded it for ever such a time till it could walk. So before that, her job was as babysitter, looking after a baby for her aunt. Then she goes back. Before I had a baby, I used to help mother, who was in the fur trade. And if there was any slits in the fur, I'd sew them up. My mother learnt me to needlework and to knit when I was about 5. I used to go to school too, but I wasn't there long. I forgot all about it now. It's such a time ago. And mother took me away because the master whacked me, though the missus used never to touch me. Now, in that small space, she has actually given us a description of her life, which also demonstrates vulnerability. The fact that once upon a time, she used to go to school, but the teachers there beat her. The master beat her, though the master's wife never touched her. Then the fact that her mother taught her needlework and taught her how to knit when she was about 5, and that she helped her mother in the fur trade. After that, she did the babysitting, and now she sells watercresses in the street out there. Now, all of this is seen as helping the family. But as the text continues, she says, when I get home after selling cresses, I stops at home. So she doesn't go out working anymore. I puts the room to right. Mother don't make me do it, I does it myself. She cleans the chairs, she takes a tub, she scrubs the floor. She does that 3 to 4 times a week. And then you have the description of their dinner. 2 slices of bread and butter and a cup of tea for breakfast. And she goes till tea time and has the same again. So we are looking at a child who is a working member of society. She has 2 meals which comprise 2 slices of bread and butter and a cup of tea. That's it. And then she tells you what she does with the money she earns. She puts it in a club and draws it out to buy clothes with. The last part of her statement, which is about spending it on sweet stuff, she says it's better than that because I have a living to earn. A child who is a member of society and who should be taken care of, here is instead speaking about the fact that she has a living to learn. And as she says, she eschews childhood. She says it's like a child to care for sugar sticks, not like one who's got a living and victuals to earn. So she has to earn if she has to eat, victuals being food. I ain't a child, and I shan't be a woman till I'm 20, but I'm past 8, I am. If you think about what is this watercress girl, she ain't a child because she earns her own money with which she buys clothes, she does not buy sugar stuff, and she eats very limited quantities of food. She keeps her house clean, she helps her mother, etc. Is this a child, or is this what we recognize as being a child? And the answer, of course, is that in societies which were not yet governed by laws which regulated child labor, there was no distinction between a child laborer and an adult laborer. So here you have an example of the vulnerability that a system can make possible for a child. Moving on from that, and the Victorian era of the 19th century is full of these kinds of examples, we look at a text from Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who wrote this poem called The Cry of the Children. And this is one stanza from that, where the children are the ones who speak through much of the poem. For oh, say the children, we are weary, we cannot run or leap. If we cared for any meadows, it were merely to drop down in them and sleep. Our knees tremble sorely in the stooping. We fall upon our faces trying to go. And underneath our heavy eyelids drooping, the reddest flower would look as pale as snow. For all day we drag our burden tiring through the cold dark underground, or all day we drive the wheels of iron in the factories round and round. Now, during the Victorian period, child labor were engaged in two main areas. One was in the coal mines, and the picture on the slide shows you children and what they did in the coal mines. So they were employed to push wagons. And because the space was low and compact, they labored on their knees, pushing and shoving. Also pulling, because the child in front pulls, the child at the back pushes, but they can't even stand up. If you look at the poem says, our knees tremble sorely in the stooping. We fall upon our faces trying to go. If that is how you spend your day, then can you stand upright? It goes on to the fact that underneath our heavy eyelids drooping, the reddest flower would look as pale as snow. Now their eyes are red because one, coal dust, two, the fact that they have very little sleep because they're woken up at 5 and sent down into the mines. And as the poet says, for all day we drag our burden tiring through the cold dark underground. Or all day we drag the wheels of iron in the factories round and round. They also worked in the mills of Manchester and other places where they worked the wheels. Their small fingers were seen as useful for certain tasks. Those certain tasks also endangered those fingers, so they could lose a finger very easily. But they had certain jobs which were exclusively meant for the children. Think of a system, and capitalism would be your system, but the Industrial Revolution, which made it possible for children to be earning members of the family. So they went out to work, they were sent out to work, except that they worked in conditions which stunted their growth, and that would be the coal mines, which made them lose body parts, which would be the mills, and wherein they lacked an education because they could go to school only on, say, Sundays. Now, Sundays are the one day of rest when they can have some rest, some sleep. Look at the first 4 lines where they say that they are weary. We cannot run or leap. If we cared for any meadows, it were merely to drop down in them and sleep. Do they have an acquaintance with meadows? No. And as the children in the poem say, if we cared at all about meadows, it would be so that we could lie down over there and sleep. They are sleep deprived. They don't have adequate food. They work in extremely terrible conditions which stunt their physical growth. Their educational growth is like nil. Think about the vulnerability of children that is demonstrated by the poem The Cry of the Children by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. There are, of course, labor laws and literature. Now, when we think about how in today's world, and if you remember right at the beginning in the first module, we spoke about how labor laws in India say that a child can work in plantations or can go out to work either when they're 14 or when they're 15. Now, labor laws such as these came about due to poems such as Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Cry of the Children. But labor laws also came about due to texts such as Charles Kingsley's Water Babies and William Blake's Chimney Sweeper. Now, in the Water Babies, you again have a chimney sweep about whom Kingsley writes, "He cried when he had to climb the dark flues, rubbing his poor knees and elbows raw." So the chimneys of the large houses of rich landowners, house owners, had to be cleaned regularly, and because it was difficult for adults to go up them, they used to have small chimney sweeps, children who could be hired as chimney sweeps. Their condition is what is delineated by Kingsley in Water Babies when he speaks about the child who cries. He cries when he has to climb up the chimneys. He cries when the soot got into his eyes, which it did every day in the week. When his master beat him, which he did every day in the week. When he had not enough to eat, which happened every day in the week likewise. So in spite of all the labor, is it that the child has enough food to eat, or that he lives a secure life? And the answer, of course, is clearly no. Similarly, when Blake writes Chimney Sweeper, and there's, of course, songs of experience and songs of innocence. So when he writes the poem Chimney Sweeper, "When my mother died, I was very young. My father sold me, while yet my tongue could scarcely cry, weep, 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 weep. So your chimneys I sweep, and in soot I sleep." My father sold me, and here you see the coming together of two structures, the family and work. The father sells him, the child, and he sells him when his tongue can scarcely cry, sweep, sweep, weep, weep. So your chimneys I sweep, and in soot I sleep. So these are children who are neglected, who have been sold into hard labor. And the poem goes on, of course, to tell us about little Tom Dacre, who cried when his head that curled like a lamb's back was shaved. So hair is shaved because otherwise all the soot will accumulate in their hair. And I said, "Hush, Tom, never mind it, for when your head's bare, you know that the soot cannot spoil your white hair." And that is, of course, one small marker of the resilience of childhood, that you see something positive in the fact that your hair has been shaved, that at least your pretty white hair won't get blackened by the soot that is all around. Now, what depictions such as these did was that they made people aware of the fact that children were laboring, that children were suffering, and that suffering was making them ill, was costing them their lives, their growth, and that this was not how society should function. So when we speak about the vulnerability of childhood, and we speak about the vulnerability of childhood in the context of work, which is determined by the society, not by the family, then society also then stepped in to set about, to bring about labor laws, which then restricted the hours that a child could work and the conditions in which a child could work. But if we think of society as regulating what happens to a child, there's also this, that sometimes a child can be outside society. Now, how does this happen? Or can this happen? Aren't all children located within society? And I'm not speaking about a child who is brought up, say, in complete seclusion away from the world. No. I'm talking about children who, even as they are located in society, also are outside society. So, several examples, and you have One of the famous ones would be to think in terms of William Golding's Lord of the Flies, written about mid-century, last century, the 20th century, where you have a bunch of children who are stranded on an island with no other humans. And what happens to them when all the safeguards and the norms of society fall away? You have the breakdown of norms that occurs over there. And you have these children who do not have anybody around them to regulate their behavior or to discipline them in any fashion. They make their own rules. Except that after a point, you have some children emerging as leaders, and in the book, you have Ralph and Jack who become the leaders. But you also have the other children who are either followers or people who stand outside. And Simon would be an example of somebody who is not really an integral part of the group. Jack, of course, makes around himself a group of people who then obey him implicitly and who are led into increasingly anarchic forms of behavior. But the inbuilt vulnerability of the child, that it edges into precarity and then, of course, leads to a total breakdown in the case of people like Simon as well as Piggy, because these are people who are then victimized by other children. So the bullying that we saw in Dockerby's Hall, in Nicholas Nickleby, or in J&R Lowood School, here then that bullying, because there are no longer any constraints whatsoever, there were still schoolmasters, there were people around them who might be able to check it. Here there are no checks. And as a result, children die. That's one extreme form. There is also Janet Wendelson's Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, which is about a child who grows up in society, in the sense that she grows up in a town with lots of other people, she goes to church, and so on and so forth, except that her mother belongs to a community of Christians who have extreme beliefs. And because of those extreme beliefs, the child is isolated from the world around her. She is also rendered different from other children. And so even as she is within society, she is also outside society. And at various points, she demonstrates how she is outside society because the kinds of things that she does in school do not fit in with what the expectations are in school. If you want to think of a comparable example, it would be to look at the childhoods in several of the Dalit biographies and autobiographies that we have in India. Pamaskaraku would be one example, where when the child goes to school, she is then isolated and singled out because of who she is. And as she makes clear, all Dalit children face similar struggles in Indian contexts, in schools where they are identified as being from the Dalit community, and they are then victimized for it. So the frames that operate within society work for certain children, but also then make other children suffer in different ways. Now, all this while, we have been talking under the assumption that when there are adults, children are reasonably safe. Of course, there are also adults who inflict abuse upon children, but otherwise adults usually keep children safe in some fashion or the other. Carol Ann Duffy has a poem which begins "Nobody Hurt You," which is about how adults don't necessarily have to be abusive to hurt a child. And it begins, nobody hurt you. Nobody turned off the light and argued with somebody else all night. The Batman on the Moors was only a movie you saw. Nobody locked the door. Your questions were answered fully. No, that didn't occur. You couldn't sing anywhere. Cared less. The moment's a blur, a film fun, laughing itself to death in the coal fire. Anyone's guess. Nobody forced you. You wanted to go that day. Begged. You chose the dress. Here are the pictures. Look at you. Look at us all, smiling and waving. Younger. The whole thing is inside your head. What you recall are impressions. We have the facts. We call the tune. The secret police of your childhood were older and wiser than you, bigger than you. Call back the sound of their voices. Boom, boom, boom. Nobody sent you away. That was an extra holiday with people you seemed to like. They were firm. There was nothing to fear. There was none but yourself to blame if it ended in tears. What does it matter now? No, no, nobody left the skid marks of sin on your soul, laid you wide open for hell. You were loved, always. We did what was best. We remember your childhood well. The poem is titled, We Remember Your Childhood Well. What it does is, it sets up a conversation. It is, of course, a dramatic monologue where the person who is speaking is the parent, and the person is speaking to a child who is now grown up, who is arguing about the fact that her childhood was not idyllic. That first sentence, nobody hurt you, which means the child said, I was hurt by. The parent dismisses it, or the adult dismisses it, saying, nobody hurt you. Nobody turned off the light and argued with somebody else all night. So the child also has these memories of doors being locked against her, and there was a bad man on the moors, and that the lights were turned off and there were fights going on in the house. And the adult goes on, your questions were answered fully. No, that didn't occur. Now, if you look at all the no's and the nobodies, right? If you look at stanza 3, where she says, nobody forced you. You wanted to go that day. So the child says, I was forced to go somewhere. And the parent turns it around. Oh, no, nobody forced you. You wanted to go. You begged. You chose the dress. And here are the pictures. Here is the evidence. Think about what it does to a child if what the child believes to be true is then called into question by the adult. And this is a form of vulnerability which is not structural, which is not exactly systemic, which is not even inherent. This is built upon relationships. And it is still embedded, of course, within the family structure. But it is also to do with the idea that because a parent or an adult has power over the child, whatever the child believes can be gaslit. You can turn it around. So when the adult says, what you recall are impressions, we have the facts. Nobody sent you away. That was an extra holiday with people you seem to like. So everything that the child says is negated by the parent. And the last stanza where it says, what does it matter now? No, no, nobody left the skid marks of sin on your soul, laid you wide open for hell. You were loved, always. We did what was best. And that one line, we did what was best. You were loved, always. It encapsulates what a lot of parents say, that whatever we did what was best for you. But the child who is vulnerable to abuse by adults, who is put into situations where the child need not necessarily have wanted to go, does not really have choice. The vulnerability of childhood is also embedded in the fact of the powerlessness of the child, especially when there are assertive parents or assertive adults who know what is best for the child and who will then determine exactly what the child must do. Look at the last line of the second stanza on the PPT, which says, there was none but yourself to blame if it ended in tears. The child's vulnerability also rests in the fact that the adult can exonerate himself or herself and place the blame upon the child. And the child, because of its powerlessness, cannot argue about it, cannot do anything about it. You see additional vulnerabilities of the child in texts such as, once again, Charles Dickens's Christmas Carol, where Tiny Tim is lame. In Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series, where the hero is both dyslexic and suffers from ADHD. You have Firdaus Kanga's novel Trying to Grow, which is again to do with physical challenges. Bapsi Sidhwa's Ice Candy Man. Children who are physically challenged and yet their brains are fully functional, working, but their bodies render them more vulnerable in a world which is arranged for able-bodied individuals, children, as well as adults. There are certain situations wherein vulnerability becomes aggravated. And these are, of course, situations of conflict, whether that conflict is between communities and races, between families, countries. Children are often the victims who suffer most. So, one of the most famous examples is, of course, the Diary of Anne Frank, written during the Holocaust by Anne Frank. But there is also Ranjit Lal's Battle for Number 19, which is set during the Sikh riots of 1984, Marianne Satrapi's Persepolis, Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, if you were to think in terms of conflict amongst families, Amitabh Ghosh's Shadow Lines, which has children at the center and which is centered around the partition. Now, conflicts render a child's life at risk, but also have other elements which contribute to making a child more vulnerable. And this includes the fact that traumas which are witnessed, which they have suffered during their childhood, they cast long shadows over the rest of their lives. Those traumas impact their life and impact the future as well. The formation of their character, so what they are as they grow into adulthood, but also the relationships that they will have in the future are impacted by situations of conflict across the world. We've talked so long about vulnerability, but it should not be forgotten that children are also inherently resilient, capable of adapting to circumstances. Of course, if the risks that they face are particularly brutal, they may not survive, but they can sometimes survive as well. And one of those iconic books about a child surviving is Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, where Huckleberry Finn is vulnerable. He manages to surmount each of the obstacles that comes his way, but he also then grows up far faster. So what happens to a child who is vulnerable and who's placed in a situation where he is rendered more vulnerable? That child has to grow up quickly. The contrast is, of course, between the adventures of Tom Sawyer and the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, both of which are by Mark Twain. Tom Sawyer can remain a child. Huckleberry Finn cannot, because Huckleberry Finn is left alone in the world, whereas Tom Sawyer still has adult figures who take care of him. Children can survive. They can survive situations wherein their vulnerability is exploited, where they are rendered precarious, where they suffer. They can still survive. But as Huck Finn demonstrates, there has to be some degree of nurture, some degree of security and affection. Only then is it possible for them to emerge whole and not to damage others in turn.